I always believed I knew my sister better than anyone else in this world. You know that kind of connection that only siblings who grew up sharing the same room, the same games, the same childhood secrets can have. That absolute certainty that there are no mysteries between you because you went through all phases of life together, from the endless afternoons playing in the backyard to the nights when you cried, hidden under the covers when our parents fought. And for 20 complete years, I lived with this unshakable conviction that Sarah and I were more than sisters. We were best friends, confidants, accomplices in all mischief and guardians of each other in all difficult moments. But there's an old saying that the person you think you know best can be exactly the one who keeps the deepest and most devastating secrets. And I discovered this in the most painful way possible on a completely ordinary Thursday afternoon. One of those when you wake up thinking it will be just another day like all the others, without imagining that your entire life is about to crumble like a house of cards hit by a sudden and relentless gust of wind. Let me tell you from the beginning, so you can understand the dimension of what happened to me, and how a single secret managed to destroy not only the relationship I had with my sister, but literally everything I believed about my family, my history, and even about who I really am. Sarah is 3 years older than me. She was always the responsible older sister, the one who took care of me when our parents needed to work late, who helped me with homework even when she was tired, who scared away the school bullies who tried to intimidate me at recess. And I looked at her with that typical admiration of a younger sister who sees the older one as a kind of invincible and protective heroine. We grew up in a simple house on the outskirts of a small town called Millbrook, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets theoretically can't survive very long because gossip spreads faster than a fire in a dry plantation. But apparently, there are secrets so well kept that not even an entire town of gossips can discover them. And my family had exactly that kind of secret buried in the depths of silence and lies carefully constructed over 2 decades. My parents, Robert and Helen, were always that kind of couple that seemed to have come out of a margarine commercial. You know those old commercials that showed the perfect family having breakfast together on Sundays, smiling as if there wasn't a single problem in the world. And throughout my entire childhood and adolescence, I really believed we had a happy family despite the financial difficulties that occasionally appeared. My father worked as a mechanic at Mr. Patterson's shop, a grumpy old man who paid poorly but at least offered stability, and my mother did cleaning in houses in the wealthier neighborhood of Millbrook, those mansions with huge gardens where the town's few rich people lived, and she came home every day with rough and red hands from so much scrubbing floors and tiles, but always with a smile on her face and some funny story about the eccentricities of her employers. We didn't have much. Our house was small, and sometimes there wasn't money for superfluous things. But I remember feeling that we had something much more valuable, which was love and unity. Or at least that's what I thought until that damned Thursday that changed absolutely everything. The day started like any other. I woke up early because I work as an elementary school teacher at a public school 15 minutes from home. I made my coffee while mentally reviewing the day's lesson plan, and I was about to leave when my cell phone rang and Sarah's name appeared on the screen, which was strange because she usually didn't call me so early. She worked as a manager of a small clothing store downtown, and her hours were different from mine, but I answered thinking it would be something quick, maybe she wanting to confirm our Saturday lunch, or ask me to buy something at the supermarket. Her voice on the other end of the line was strange, trembling and muffled as if she was crying or trying very desperately not to cry. And immediately my heart raced because Sarah wasn't the type who cried easily. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept calm in crisis situations, the one who consoled others and never needed to be consoled. So hearing her in that state left me instantly terrified. She said, "Emma, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." And I asked what had happened, if she was okay, if someone had gotten hurt, but she just repeated that she needed to talk to me in person, that it couldn't be over the phone, that it was about something very serious, and that it would change everything. And those words would change everything echoed in my head like a sinister omen while I called the school saying I had a family emergency and couldn't go to work that day. I drove to Sarah's house with my heart pounding in my chest and millions of catastrophic possibilities running through my head. I thought maybe she had discovered some serious illness, or that her marriage to Michael was ending, or that something terrible had happened to our parents. But none of my mental theories came close to the reality that awaited me. When I arrived, I found my sister sitting at the kitchen table with swollen and red eyes, obvious that she had spent the entire night crying, and in front of her was an old shoebox that I had never seen before. One of those boxes that people use to store old photographs, letters, and memories from the past. She hugged me as soon as I entered and started crying again, and I stood there not understanding anything, stroking her hair and saying that everything would be okay even without having the slightest idea of what was happening. Until finally she pulled away, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and said the words that initiated the collapse of my entire reality. "Emma, you need to know the truth about our family, about Mom and Dad, about you, and I can't bear carrying this weight alone anymore. I should have told you a long time ago, but I promised I would never tell. And now Mom is dying, and I can't let you find out another way." The world seemed to stop completely at that moment, as if someone had pressed the pause button on reality, and everything around me had frozen except the sound of my own breathing, which became heavy and irregular. My mother was dying. What do you mean my mother was dying and no one had told me? And what truth was Sarah talking about? What secret related to me could be so terrible that my own mother had made my sister promise never to reveal? The questions stumbled over each other in my head, but none could come out of my mouth because suddenly I was afraid, a visceral and primitive fear that the answer would be something I couldn't bear, something that would destroy the person I thought I was. Sarah noticed my paralysis and held my hands tightly, those same hands that had held me when I learned to walk, when I had nightmares, when I suffered my first romantic breakup. And she began to speak with her voice, still trembling but determined, as if she had rehearsed those words 1,000 times in her head before finally saying them out loud. She told me that our mother had received a diagnosis of advanced stage pancreatic cancer 2 months ago, that the doctors had given her at most 6 months to live, and that Helen had made Sarah and our father swear they wouldn't tell me because she didn't want me to see her waste away and suffer, because she wanted my last memories of her to be happy and not filled with pain and goodbyes. And although I was shocked and furious that they had hidden something so important from me, this part was still not the worst. It wasn't the secret Sarah was talking about. This was just the context that made it impossible to continue keeping the real secret hidden. Sarah took a deep breath, opened the old shoebox, and removed a series of documents, photographs faded by time and yellowed letters, and then she said the words that literally shattered my identity. "Emma, you're not my biological sister. Mom and Dad aren't your biological parents. You were adopted when you were only 2 months old, and the reason they never told you is because your birth circumstances were extremely traumatic and complex, and they thought it was better you never knew." I simply couldn't process that information immediately. It was as if my brain had categorically refused to accept that new reality, because it was completely incompatible with everything I knew about my life, my family, my history. Adopted? What do you mean, adopted? I perfectly remember seeing photos of me as a baby in family albums, photos at the maternity ward with my mother holding a baby that supposedly was me, photos of my first birthday, of my baptism. How could all of that be a lie? Sarah must have noticed the incredulity on my face because she started showing me the documents, one by one, each paper revealing one more layer of the elaborate lie that had been my entire life. There was my original birth certificate, where a different name appeared: Charlotte Marie Thompson, daughter of Jennifer Thompson, and unknown father, born at Millbrook General Hospital on March 15, 1993. And that date was exactly my birth date. But the name was wrong. Everything was wrong. Or rather, everything was right. And it was my entire life that had been a meticulously constructed farce. Sarah continued explaining with her voice increasingly hoarse from so much crying and talking. She told me that Jennifer Thompson was only 17 years old when she got pregnant. that she came from an extremely religious and conservative family that expelled her from home when they discovered the pregnancy, that she was living on the streets of Millbrook for months, until our mother, or rather Helen, found her passed out from hunger and dehydration in an alley behind the laundromat, where she worked at the time. Helen took Jennifer to our house, convinced Robert to let her stay until the baby was born, and during those months, Jennifer and Helen developed a very close relationship. Helen took care of her, as if she were her own daughter, took her to prenatal appointments, bought little clothes for the baby that was coming, and Jennifer seemed to finally be finding some hope and stability after so much suffering. But then I was born, and 3 days after bringing me home from the maternity ward, Jennifer simply disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving only a letter explaining that she didn't have the emotional, psychological, or financial conditions to raise a child, that she had gotten pregnant from an abusive relationship, and that every time she looked at me, she saw the face of the man who had hurt her, and that she begged Helen and Robert to keep me, to raise me as their daughter, to give me the love and family that she would never be able to provide. Tears ran down my face without me even trying to control them, while Sarah continued revealing every detail of that story that was mine, but that I was learning about for the first time as if it were about a complete stranger. Helen and Robert were desperate initially, didn't know what to do with a baby that wasn't theirs, tried to find Jennifer to return the child or at least formalize some kind of legal custody, but she had disappeared completely, as if she had been swallowed by the earth. No one knew where she had gone. Her family refused even to talk about her, as if the very mention of her name was an unacceptable moral stain. Then weeks passed, then months, and Helen had become completely attached to me. She fed me, changed my diapers, stayed up all night when I cried. And Robert saw how that unexpected baby had brought a new light to his wife's eyes, who had been suffering in silence for years because she couldn't get pregnant. They had tried to have children for so long without success. And suddenly there I was, a gift fallen from heaven in a completely unexpected and unconventional way. Sarah was only 3 years old at the time, so obviously didn't fully understand what was happening. She just knew that suddenly she had a baby sister at home and was happy to help Mommy take care of me, and Helen and Robert decided they would go through the adoption process legally, but would tell everyone that I was their biological daughter, that Helen had discovered a late surprise pregnancy and had given birth to me prematurely, and since Millbrook was a small town and they knew the right people, they managed to falsify some documents with help from a doctor friend, and suddenly, officially, I was Emma Rose Mitchell, legitimate daughter of Robert and Helen Mitchell, sister of Sarah Mitchell. And no one would ever question this story because there was no reason to question it. They thought they were protecting me, sparing me from the stigma of being the abandoned daughter of a homeless teenager, giving me a real family and a respectable name, and for 20 years, this lie was maintained with absolute perfection. Not even the closest relatives knew the truth, because Helen and Robert had decided that the fewer people who knew, the easier it would be to keep the secret forever. But Sarah knew because even though she was only 3 years old at the time, she had fragmented memories of that period, vaguely remembered a sad girl who stayed in the house's guest room, remembered hearing whispered conversations from her parents late at night, and when she got older, around 12 years old, she started asking persistent questions until finally Helen sat down with her and told her the whole truth, but made Sarah swear by everything that was most sacred that she would never, ever, under any circumstances, tell me because I was happy, had a normal and healthy childhood, and knowing that I was adopted and had been abandoned by my biological mother would only bring unnecessary pain and confusion. And Sarah, being the obedient and responsible daughter she always was, kept that secret faithfully for 8 complete years, carrying alone the weight of knowing a fundamental truth about my existence that I myself was completely unaware of. Now, sitting in that kitchen with all those revelations falling on me like a relentless avalanche, I felt completely lost, as if the ground had been pulled out from under my feet and I was falling into an endless abyss where nothing made sense anymore. Who was I? If my parents weren't my parents, if my sister wasn't technically my sister, if my own name had been invented, then who the hell was Emma Rose Mitchell? And Jennifer Thompson, my biological mother, where was she now? Was she alive? Did she have other children? Did she ever regret abandoning me? And what about my biological father, this man who had abused Jennifer and whose face she saw in me? Who was he? Where was he? Did I have biological siblings somewhere in the world who didn't even know of my existence? The questions exploded in my mind faster than I could formulate them, and each one brought with it a renewed anguish, a growing feeling that I had lived a lie for 20 entire years and now needed to completely reconstruct my understanding of who I was and where I came from. Sarah continued showing me the contents of that cursed box that had turned my life upside down. There were photographs of Jennifer pregnant next to Helen, and it was disturbing to see how young Jennifer was. She looked more like a child than an adult woman about to give birth. Her face had that thinness typical of someone who had gone hungry for a long time, and her eyes carried a deep sadness that was visible even through the faded photographs from 20 years ago. There was also the letter she left on the night she ran away, written in a trembling handwriting full of smudges that seemed to be from tears. And Sarah handed it to me to read personally. And each word of that letter was like a stab in my chest, because there was my biological mother explaining why she couldn't love me, why looking at me caused so much pain, that she preferred to completely disappear from my life than to have to carry that impossible emotional burden. The letter said, "Dear Helen and dear Robert, I have no words to thank you for everything you've done for me in recent months. You saved me when I had no more hope. You gave me a roof, food, affection, and a family when my own family expelled me as if I were trash. But I can't do this. I can't be a mother to this child because every time I look at her I see his face. I see that horrible night when he hurt me in ways I'll never be able to forget. I see the fear, the pain, the shame, and I know this isn't the baby's fault. I know she's innocent and deserves all the love in the world, but I simply can't. I tried during these 3 days since we left the hospital. I tried to breastfeed her, rock her, feel that connection that all mothers are supposed to feel. But I only feel emptiness and panic, and I'm so afraid of ending up hurting her somehow, physically or emotionally, because I myself am so hurt inside that there's nothing left to give to another person. Please take care of her, love her as she deserves to be loved. Tell her when she grows up that her biological mother didn't abandon her because she didn't want her, but because she wanted her too much to risk destroying her with all the unresolved traumas and the darkness she carries inside. And if someday she wants to find me when she's an adult, I'll be willing to explain everything personally. But for now, I need to disappear and try to fix the broken pieces of myself before I can be anything to anyone. With all gratitude and all remorse, Jennifer." I finished reading that letter with my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the paper. And for the first time since Sarah had started revealing everything, I felt something beyond shock and confusion. I felt a deep and burning anger, not necessarily at Jennifer, because somehow in a tortuous and complex way I could understand that she had been just a traumatized teenager doing the best she could in an impossible situation. But I felt anger at Helen and Robert for having decided to hide this from me my entire life, for having made Sarah carry this heavy secret for 8 years, for having stolen from me the right to know my own story and make my own decisions about my identity. Who were they to decide what I should or shouldn't know about my own life? What right did they have to build such an elaborate lie and force me to live inside it without even knowing that a different truth existed waiting to be discovered? I got up from that table so abruptly that the chair fell backward with a loud crash, and I said to Sarah that I needed to leave, needed to process all of that alone. But she grabbed my arm and said, "There's still more. There's one thing I still haven't told you, and that you need to know before you leave here." And I couldn't imagine what could be worse than everything that had already been revealed. But Sarah had that expression on her face that indicated that the worst was in fact still to come. She took another document from the bottom of that cursed box. It was an old and yellowed newspaper clipping, the ink already somewhat faded but still legible, and the headline said, "Millbrook teenager killed in car accident, Leaves baby daughter, and below, there was a small and grainy photo of a face I immediately recognized from the photos I had just seen. It was Jennifer Thompson, and the news was dated 6 months after my birth. My heart stopped. I literally felt as if my heart had stopped beating for an entire second. Jennifer was dead? My biological mother had died 6 months after abandoning me? Sarah confirmed by slowly nodding her head, with new tears running down her face, and explained that Jennifer had gone to a bigger city a few hours away, had tried to restart her life there, got a job at a fast food restaurant, shared an apartment with 3 other girls, and was apparently beginning to rebuild her life. When the accident happened, she was coming back from work by bus on a rainy night when a drunk driver lost control of his car and collided head-on with the bus, killing Jennifer and 4 other people instantly. Helen and Robert found out about the accident because the police managed to trace that Jennifer had lived in Millbrook before moving and contacted them to ask if they knew relatives or friends who could identify the body and take care of the burial. And it was a terrible shock for them to discover that the girl they had taken in, who had left her baby in their care, had died in such a tragic and premature way. They went to the funeral, paid part of the expenses because Jennifer's family refused to have any involvement, and Helen cried copiously because in a way she had loved Jennifer like a daughter during those months of pregnancy. And now she needed to carry the guilt of raising Jennifer's baby, while Jennifer herself was dead and buried in a distant cemetery with no one to visit her grave. And the decision to never tell me about the adoption became even stronger after that, because now it wasn't just a matter of protecting me from the trauma of abandonment. It was also protecting me from the trauma of knowing that my biological mother had died when I was only 6 months old, that I could never meet her, talk to her, truly understand her story beyond the letters and photographs, that this possibility had been violently ripped away by a drunk driver on a rainy night almost 20 years ago. I collapsed. I simply collapsed right there on Sarah's kitchen floor, my entire body trembling with uncontrollable sobs while I tried to process that brutal overload of devastating information. My identity had been a lie. My biological mother had abandoned me, but for reasons I could understand even through the pain. And now she was dead, and I would never have the chance to know her, to ask questions, to try to build some kind of relationship, or at least some kind of mutual understanding. Sarah knelt beside me and hugged me while we both cried, and she kept apologizing repeatedly, saying she should have told me before, that carrying this secret had been a terrible burden during all these years, that she saw how I talked about our happy family and about how we were lucky to have such loving parents, and she had to bite her tongue not to scream the truth that burned inside her like corrosive acid. After an indeterminate time, it could have been minutes or hours because I had completely lost track of time in that traumatic state of shock, I finally managed to minimally compose myself, got up from the floor with trembling legs, wiped my face with my hands, and said to Sarah that I needed to go see our parents, or rather Helen and Robert, because I didn't even know how to call them anymore, since technically they weren't my parents, but the only parental figures I had known in life. Sarah tried to convince me to wait a bit, to process everything better before confronting them. But I was beyond reason at that moment. I was in a state of pure adrenaline fueled by anger, pain, confusion, and a desperate need to hear from them personally the explanations for that 20-year lie that had been my entire existence. I drove to the house where I grew up, that same small and cozy house that had been the scene of so many happy childhood memories, but that now seemed sinister and false, like a theater set mounted to deceive an unsuspecting audience. Helen was in the garden taking care of the roses that had always been her favorite hobby, wearing that old floral apron she had had for decades. And when she saw me arriving, she smiled with that warm and maternal smile that always made me feel safe and loved, completely oblivious to the emotional hurricane that was about to descend upon her. I couldn't hold back. I simply couldn't pretend that everything was okay, even for a second, so I stopped right in front of her and said with my voice loaded with accusation and pain, "Why did you never tell me I was adopted? Why did you live a lie with me for 20 entire years? Why did you take away from me the right to know who I really am?" The smile instantly disappeared from Helen's face and was replaced by an expression of pure panic. She dropped the pruning shears she was holding and became completely pale, as if she had seen a ghost, and whispered with her voice almost inaudible, "Sarah told you, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, loaded with disappointment and perhaps even betrayal, because her older daughter had broken the promise to keep the secret forever." I confirmed that, yes, Sarah had told me everything, about Jennifer, about the adoption, about the accident, about all the carefully constructed lies, and Helen started crying silently, tears running down her aged face, marked by wrinkles that seemed to have deepened suddenly at that moment of inevitable confrontation. She asked to go inside and talk calmly, said she had so much to explain and that I needed to understand the context and the reasons behind the decisions she and Robert had made. But I was so consumed by anger that I didn't want to hear justifications, didn't want context. I just wanted her to acknowledge that she had been wrong, that she had stolen from me something fundamental and irreplaceable, which was the knowledge of my own origin. But Helen started talking anyway, with that quiet determination she always had, and said that when they received me that night, after Jennifer disappeared, they saw a divine opportunity. She had suffered 3 miscarriages over the years, and the doctors had said she probably would never be able to carry a pregnancy to term. And suddenly, there was a healthy and perfect baby who needed a family, and they had so much love to give. She said that the decision not to tell me about the adoption wasn't taken lightly. They talked exhaustively about it, even consulted a psychologist who suggested that adopted children develop better emotionally when they grow up knowing the truth from early on. But when Jennifer died 6 months later, everything changed, because now it wasn't just hiding the fact of adoption. It was also hiding that my biological mother had died tragically, and that I was the product of a violent aggression. And Helen genuinely believed that would be too heavy a burden for a child to carry, that it would be more kind and loving to raise me as their biological daughter and spare me from all that pain and complexity. She said that each year that passed, it became harder to tell the truth, because with each birthday, each Christmas, each happy moment they shared as a family, the lie became more rooted and solid, and eventually she convinced herself that I was really her daughter in all the senses that mattered, except the biological, and that the biological truth was just an irrelevant technical detail that didn't need to be revealed. But this wasn't a mere technical detail to me. It was literally my identity, my story, my truth, and it had been stolen from me by people who claimed to love me more than anything in the world, and I shouted all of that to Helen right there in the garden, let all the anger and all the pain explode without any filter or containment, and she stood there accepting each accusation, each harsh word, crying silently but not trying to defend herself, because deep down she knew she had no real defense, knew she had been wrong, even though her intentions were genuinely loving and protective. Robert arrived home in the middle of our discussion, saw the chaotic scene of his wife crying and me shouting, and immediately understood that the secret had been revealed, and he also became pale and devastated. But unlike Helen, who passively accepted my accusations, Robert tried to argue, said they had done the best they could in an impossible situation, that they loved me as a legitimate daughter, and that nothing changed that love just because my DNA was different. But everything had changed, absolutely everything, because now I looked at these people I had called mother and father for 20 years and saw strangers, saw liars, saw people who had built an elaborate fantasy and forced me to live inside it without my consent or knowledge. I said I needed time, that I couldn't even look at them at that moment, that maybe one day I could forgive. But now I only felt betrayal and anger, and I ran out of that house while Helen desperately shouted my name behind me. But I didn't stop, didn't turn around, just got in the car and drove without a specific destination. I just needed to get away from that place that suddenly seemed as toxic and suffocating as a prison disguised as a welcoming home. I spent the next few days in a state of emotional numbness, didn't go to work, didn't answer calls from anyone, barely ate or slept, just lay in my apartment reliving each childhood and adolescence memory through this new lens of knowledge that made everything questionable and suspicious. That time, a distant aunt commented that I didn't look anything like my parents, Did she know? Those whispered conversations I occasionally heard late at night when I was a child, were they about me and about the secret? And all those times Helen hugged me tightly, saying she loved me more than anything in the world. Was there guilt mixed in that love? How much of my life had been authentic, and how much had been carefully orchestrated performance? Sarah tried to visit me several times, but I didn't open the door. I was too confused about my feelings toward her too. Because on one hand, she had finally told me the truth and freed us both from the weight of that secret. But on the other hand, she had kept it from me for 8 entire years, had looked me in the eyes hundreds of times, knowing something fundamental about me that I myself was unaware of. And that seemed like a betrayal somehow, even though rationally, I understood she was just fulfilling a promise made when she was still a child. Michael, Sarah's husband, finally managed to talk to me on the phone after 4 days of total silence, and he told me that Sarah was feeling terribly guilty and wasn't able to sleep for fear of having destroyed our sisterly relationship. And that made me feel even worse, because even through all my pain and anger, I didn't want Sarah to suffer. She had just been another victim of that impossible situation created by the misguided decisions of adults. Eventually, I agreed to meet Sarah again, but this time at a neutral cafe far from either of our houses. And when we saw each other, it was strange and painful, because there was a distance between us that had never existed before, as if that revealed secret had created an abyss we didn't know how to cross. We talked for hours. She told me in more detail about what it had been like to carry that weight for so long. How there were nights when she almost told me everything, but the fear of breaking the promise and disappointing our mother prevented her. How she had begged Helen to tell me the truth when I turned 18, but Helen had said that now I was already a formed adult, and telling would only cause unnecessary trauma and potentially destroy our family, so it was better to take the secret to the grave. And it was when Sarah mentioned the grave that she let slip one more piece of information I didn't know. Helen had at most 3 months to live according to the most optimistic doctors. The cancer was advancing rapidly, and she had already started refusing some treatments because she wanted to spend her last days with quality instead of sedated and nauseated by aggressive chemotherapy. That information hit me like a punch in the stomach, because even with all the anger and feeling of betrayal I was carrying, Helen was still the only mother I had known, the woman who had taken care of me when I was sick, who had dried my tears when I suffered my first heartbreak, who had celebrated each small achievement of mine as if they were Olympic victories. And the idea of losing her in a matter of months was absolutely devastating. And even more devastating was the realization that I would probably spend her last months of life distant and resentful. And then she would die, and I would be left with the unbearable weight of never having resolved things with her, of having let our relationship end in bitterness and accusations instead of forgiveness and reconciliation. Sarah noticed the conflict on my face and held my hand across the cafe table and said that no matter what I decided to do, whether to forgive or not forgive, whether to reconcile or maintain distance, she would be by my side because now that the secret was revealed, she could finally support me openly instead of carrying alone that impossible burden. That night I took the old shoebox that Sarah had given me, the one that contained all the documents, photographs, and letters related to my true origin, and examined each item carefully, trying to mentally construct an image of who Jennifer Thompson had been beyond the traumatized and desperate girl in the photographs. There was a photo of her smiling. It must have been taken before the pregnancy, before the trauma, and in that photo, she looked like just a common and happy teenager with her whole life ahead. And it was anguishing to think about how quickly everything had crumbled for her, how a single violent event had completely destroyed her trajectory and eventually led to her premature death. I wondered what my life would have been like if Jennifer had survived, if she would have eventually looked for me when I got older, if we would have managed to build some kind of relationship, if I would have grown up knowing both versions of my story instead of just the sanitized and false version that was presented to me. And then I found at the bottom of the box something that Sarah apparently hadn't noticed or had forgotten to mention. It was a second letter from Jennifer. But this one wasn't addressed to Helen and Robert. This one was addressed directly to me, with my birth name Charlotte written in trembling handwriting on the envelope yellowed by time. My hands trembled as I opened that envelope, aware that I was about to read words written by my biological mother specifically for me, a message that had waited 20 years to be read. And part of me was afraid of what those words might say, of what more they might reveal or destroy. The letter was short, but each word carried immense emotional weight, and it said, "To my daughter Charlotte, if you're reading this, it means you've grown up and somehow discovered about me and about the circumstances of your birth, and I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but also the most necessary because I was too broken to be the mother you deserved. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. I loved you so much that I chose to give you a chance, to have a better life with people who could give you everything I couldn't: stability, security, a functional and loving family. And I hope Helen and Robert have been wonderful parents to you, because they showed me so much kindness when I needed it most that I know they would do anything to make you happy and keep you safe. I know you're probably angry at me for abandoning you, and you have every right to feel that. But please understand that I was just a scared and traumatized child doing the best I could in an impossible situation. And my greatest hope is that you grew up happy and healthy and never felt lack of love, because even though I couldn't give it, I was sure Helen and Robert could give enough love for all of us. I love you more than words can express, and my only wish is that you have a beautiful and full life filled with all the good things the universe can offer, with all my love and all my regret. Your biological mother, Jennifer." I finished reading that letter with my face soaked in tears, and something inside me began to break, not in a destructive way, but in a liberating way, as if all the conflicting emotions I had been carrying for days finally found an escape valve. Jennifer had loved me in her imperfect and wounded way. Helen and Robert had loved me in their imperfect and lying way. And all of them had made terrible but well-intentioned choices, trying to protect me from pains that ironically ended up hitting me anyway, just in different and delayed ways. And I realized at that moment, crying alone in my apartment, with that old letter in hand, that holding on to anger and resentment was only hurting me more, was only stealing from me the little time I still had with Helen before cancer took her away definitively, and that I needed to find a way to make peace with all of that before it was too late, and I was left with regrets that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The next day I called Sarah and said I was ready to visit Helen, but that I needed her with me for moral support because I still didn't know how I would react to seeing my adoptive mother again after everything that had been revealed. Sarah agreed immediately, and we went together to our parents' house that same afternoon. And when we entered, we found Helen much weaker and frailer than just a week before. The cancer was clearly advancing rapidly, and she practically lived on the living room couch now because she no longer had energy to do much beyond watching television and receiving visits from palliative care nurses who came daily to administer pain medication. When she saw me, her eyes instantly filled with tears, and she tried to get up, but I gestured for her to stay seated, and I went to her. I knelt beside the couch and held her hand, which was frighteningly thin and cold, and said we needed to truly talk about everything. Without lies, without omissions, without trying to protect me from difficult truths, because I was an adult and deserved to know my complete story, even if it hurt. Helen agreed with her head and started talking. Her voice was weak but determined, and she told me absolutely everything, every detail that had been omitted until then, how Jennifer had been raped by an older man who attended the same church as her family, how her family had blamed Jennifer for the aggression, saying she must have provoked it somehow with inappropriate clothing or seductive behavior, how they had given her two impossible options, which were to have a dangerous clandestine, abortion, or leave home and never come back. And Jennifer, who had been raised in a rigid religious faith, couldn't conceive the idea of aborting, so she chose the second option, even knowing it meant becoming homeless and completely helpless. Helen told how Jennifer often woke up in the middle of the night screaming and sweating from nightmares about the aggression, how she was terrified of unknown men and trembled visibly whenever Robert entered the room, how the pregnancy had been a constant psychological torment because her body was literally generating a living reminder of the worst trauma of her life, And Helen admitted, with tears running down her face, that maybe she and Robert had been selfish in keeping me, that maybe they should have made more effort to find Jennifer after she ran away and help her receive adequate psychological treatment and support to raise her own daughter, but at the time they genuinely believed they were doing the best for everyone involved, giving Jennifer the chance to start over without the constant weight of that traumatic reminder, and giving me the chance to have a stable and functional family. She said that the decision to keep the adoption secret had been initially made thinking they would tell when I got older, maybe in adolescence. But when Jennifer died so tragically and suddenly, they panicked, because how would they tell a small child that her biological mother had died in an accident before she could have any chance to know her? And as the years passed, that initial lie had solidified so much that reversing it seemed more destructive than maintaining it. Robert entered the room while Helen was talking and joined the conversation, admitting his own guilt and regrets, saying he had argued with Helen several times over the years about telling the truth, but always ended up being convinced it was better to wait a little longer, until after high school graduation, after college, after I got a stable job, and so there was always a convenient excuse to indefinitely postpone that difficult but necessary conversation. He said that when Helen received the diagnosis of terminal cancer a few months ago, his first reaction had been to finally want to tell me everything, to clear his conscience before dying. But Helen had begged him not to tell because she didn't want my last memories of her to be tainted by anger and resentment. She wanted to die with the illusion that she had been a good mother who had protected her daughter from unnecessary pain. Hearing all of that directly from them, with all the raw and unfiltered details, was simultaneously devastating and somehow cathartic. Because finally, there were no more secrets, there were no more half-truths or strategic omissions. It was all exposed in the harsh light of complete honesty. And I realized that even with all the monumental mistakes Helen and Robert had made, they had genuinely loved me the best way they knew how. They had given me a happy and safe childhood. They had sacrificed a lot to ensure I had opportunities and education. And that real and concrete love wasn't invalidated by the revelation that we didn't share DNA. They were my parents in all practical and emotional senses, even though biologically I had come from somewhere else. And Jennifer was also my mother in a different but equally real way. The mother who had loved me enough to give me up for adoption to people who could offer me what she couldn't. I started going to visit Helen daily after that conversation. Sometimes Sarah went along, and sometimes it was just me. And we spent hours talking about everything, from old childhood memories to her own fears and regrets about imminent death. And slowly we rebuilt our relationship on a new foundation of complete honesty, instead of the old foundation of well-intentioned lies. Helen told me stories she had never shared before. How she herself had been informally adopted by an aunt when her own parents died in a car accident when she was 5 years old, and how that experience had shaped her understanding that family is defined by love and commitment and not by blood ties, and maybe that's why she had been so comfortable building that lie about my origin, because for her it genuinely made no difference whether I had come out of her uterus or not. I was her daughter in all the senses that mattered. Sarah also opened up more about what it had been like to carry that secret for 8 years, admitted there were moments when she resented being the only one who knew, that she was jealous of how I could live carefree in ignorance while she carried that weight, but also recognized that ultimately she was the older sister and had the duty to protect the younger sister even when that protection took complicated and morally ambiguous forms. And through all these difficult conversations and these painful revelations, the three of us slowly healed the wounds that secret had caused. Not because the hurts completely disappeared, but because we actively chose to work through them instead of letting them transform into permanent and irreconcilable resentment. One day, while I was sitting next to Helen, who was practically sleeping all the time now due to the strong pain medications, I pulled out that letter from Jennifer from my pocket and read it aloud to her. And when I finished, Helen opened her eyes and whispered in a weak voice that Jennifer had been one of the bravest people she had ever met, that making that choice to leave the baby behind, knowing it was best for the child, even though it was devastating for the mother, required a strength and a truly deep love that few people possess. And then Helen said something that finally brought some real peace to my fragmented heart. She said that if there was life after death, and if she met Jennifer there, she promised to tell her that she had kept the promise, that she had taken care of me and loved me, and given me the best life possible, and that although she had made the terrible mistake of hiding the truth for too long, in the end I had discovered and had managed to know the complete story and make peace with everything before it was too late. Helen died 3 weeks after that conversation, on a quiet Saturday morning with the whole family around her bed, Sarah holding one hand, me holding the other, and Robert sitting at the foot of the bed with his face buried in his hands. And she simply stopped breathing so smoothly that initially we didn't notice until the nurse checked the pulse and confirmed she had departed. The funeral was small, but full of people who genuinely loved Helen. Neighbors she had helped over the years, work colleagues, church friends, and during the wake, several people approached me and Sarah telling stories about how Helen had positively impacted their lives with small acts of kindness and generosity. And each story was a reminder that despite all her mistakes and her lies, Helen had been fundamentally a good person trying to do the best she could in a complicated and imperfect world. After the funeral, I asked Sarah to take me to Jennifer's grave, which was a few hours away, in a small and poorly maintained cemetery, where practically no one ever visited because she had no family or friends who cared enough to make the trip. I brought fresh flowers and cleaned the headstone that was dirty and covered with moss, and I stood there for a long time just looking at that piece of marble that marked the place where my biological mother had been buried almost 20 years ago. This woman I never met, but who somehow had completely shaped my existence through the impossible choices she made when she was only 17 years old. And I talked to her right there, not caring if Sarah would find it strange or if other cemetery visitors were looking. I simply spoke everything that was in my heart, thanked her for giving me life even in terrible circumstances, thanked her for having the courage to give me to people who could raise me better than she could at that moment, said I understood her choices and held no resentment, and promised I would come back regularly to take care of her grave because now that I knew where she was, I wouldn't allow her to be forgotten and abandoned as she had been for 2 decades. In the months that followed, I slowly began to rebuild my identity, incorporating both the story of Emma Rose Mitchell and the story of Charlotte Marie Thompson, recognizing that both were legitimate and real parts of who I am, that I didn't need to choose between one version or another, but could accept and honor both origins. I started going to therapy to process all the trauma of that revelation and the complex issues of identity and abandonment that came with it, and my therapist helped me understand that it's completely normal and valid to feel a confusing mix of conflicting emotions about all of this, that I don't need to have completely resolved my feelings or to have reached definitive conclusions, that I can simply exist in the ambiguous space of someone who was deeply hurt by lies, but who also recognizes the real love that existed behind those lies. Sarah and I became even closer after all of this, because now finally, there were no more secrets between us, nothing hidden or unsaid, and she supported me in every step of the healing and reconciliation process. Robert had more difficulty because Helen had been his anchor and his partner for more than 30 years, and without her he seemed completely lost. But gradually, we also rebuilt our relationship on more honest bases. He started telling me stories he had never shared before about my early years, what it was like to feed me with a bottle in the middle of the night, how I got sick with pneumonia when I was 1 year old, and he and Helen stayed up all night at the hospital praying for me to survive. And each story was a confirmation that their love had been real and deep, even though the factual basis of our relationship had been built on lies. Today, almost a year after that Thursday that changed everything, I can say I'm still processing, still healing, still have days when I'm angry about the lies and days when I feel gratitude for the love. And both feelings are valid and true simultaneously. I learned that family is something much more complex and nuanced than simple blood ties, that truth and love don't always go together perfectly, but both are necessary for authentic and healthy relationships, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or agreeing with what was done, but means choosing not to let resentment poison the rest of your life. And if there's any lesson I can take from this entire devastating and transformative experience, it's that secrets, no matter how well-intentioned, always eventually come to light, and the consequences of revealing too late are always more painful than having been honest from the beginning. And that if you really love someone, the most important thing you can give them is not protection from the truth, but the truth itself, accompanied by support to process and overcome it together. So if you've made it this far in this crazy and painful and transformative story of my life, I want you to know you're not alone. If you also carry heavy family secrets, if you discovered devastating truths about your origin, if you're trying to reconcile love and betrayal at the same time. And I would love to hear your story in the comments below, because sharing these difficult experiences is what helps us all process and heal together. Tell me, have you ever discovered a family secret that completely changed your perspective on your life? How did you deal with it? Were you able to forgive the people who lied, even if it was out of love? Leave your experience here below, because each story matters and can help another person who's going through the same thing to feel less alone in this impossible journey of rebuilding identity and relationships after everything you believed is questioned and transformed. And if this story touched you in some way, if you felt along with me each painful revelation and each difficult step toward healing, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to continue sharing real and vulnerable stories about the complexities of family life, relationships, identity, and how we survive when everything crumbles and needs to be rebuilt from scratch with pieces that no longer fit the way we thought they fit. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and for being part of this community of people brave enough to face difficult truths and share their own vulnerabilities with the world.